Okay, today we're going to talk about the rise of dictators. As you know, dictatorships were incredibly instrumental in the major events that led to World War II. So it's really important that we talk about dictatorships and the circumstances that allowed for their rise and the mindsets and ideologies that fueled their support. So let's move forward with our presentation. These are the four dictators we're primarily going to be talking about. And so on that list would be in Germany, obviously, Adolf Hitler, in Italy, Benito Mussolini, in Spain, Francisco Franco, although we're really not going to be focusing too much on Franco because that was sort of fairly isolated within Spain and didn't have too much to do with anything related to World War II. We'll be talking about Joseph Stalin in the Soviet Union, and of course, the military dictatorship that characterized Japan in the 30s and 40s. So, one question that is really important to ask as we start to have this rising totalitarian government system across Europe and across the world, especially in Europe, why aren't France and England victims to this rise in dictatorship? And I think it's really important to understand that France and England were the most established of the democracies, and they had really powerful democracies with strong constitutions, strong parliamentary systems, with an elected body of representatives, and a system for dealing with power struggles and disagreements and such. So it is well known at this time in the aftermath of World War I that France and England have the strongest democracies. In the other countries, we see that Germany tries to establish a democracy in the Weimar Republic, but that fails due to totalitarian leaders. Okay, so when we talk about the different styles of government, what really are we going to be looking at? We're going to be looking at, of course, Nazism, which is often considered to be a form of fascism. So, Nazism isn't necessarily a style of government that we would ever see again or that was ever used by any other country. It's very unique to Germany. Communism, which we've already talked about a little bit, but you should understand the role of communism in creating a dictator and what that looks like. Fascism, and the military dictatorship as it appears in Japan. So let's start off by talking about fascism. You may have heard the word fascism. I would actually guess that you probably have. So it's a political movement and or a government system. So when we talk about fascism as it was used during World War II or in the years leading up to World War II, we talk about usually authoritarian leadership, a restriction of individual rights. The word I'm going to use here is ultranationalist beliefs, which means that everything is done for the benefit of a nation or a state. So in the case of Italy, it's to make Italy as strong as possible. And, anything is fair game in the quest to make Italy strong. And then, of course, any opposition is forcibly oppressed. Any opposition is forcibly suppressed, right? So if you're a person who disagrees with something that's going on in a fascist state, you would likely be arrested or killed, or some action will be taken against you because it's not a system of government where dissension and disagreement are encouraged. In democracy, as you know, there's the Senate floor and the legislative floor where, disagreement is encouraged and debate happens regularly. That is not the case in totalitarian governments. So I will explain the picture in just one second, the picture on the slide. The one thing that maybe sets fascism apart from other systems of totalitarian leadership is its emphasis on private property. So citizens are permitted and encouraged often to have private property, but it can be taken away. As you can probably see, there's not a very substantial constitutional system or constitution within a fascist government, so there's no protection of your right to property. So if your land or your house or your possessions are interfering with the goals of the government, then that would be taken away quickly and without question. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about this picture on the slide. So this is the logo of fascism after it was created or after it was founded by Benito Mussolini in Italy. It comes from the Italian word fascio. So if you take Italian, you may know this word, which means bundle. And so the idea with fascism is that together is stronger than alone, right? So the logo in the picture represents the idea that a single rod, if you go out into your yard and you grab a stick and you break it over your knee, fairly easy to do. But if you go grab an entire bundle of, say, 50 sticks and you hold them together in a bunch and you try and break that over your knee, that's going to be substantially harder because that is stronger. So the idea is together we become stronger. So this is the logo that came to be associated with fascism. So when fascism started, or the idea of a fascio, it didn't have a negative connotation to other people. So Mussolini proudly asserted that he was a fascist. The name of his initial political party was Fasci Italiani di Combattimento. But now, because of the actions of World War II, we do associate fascism with dictatorships and with cruelty. And so anytime you would hear that now would be usually in reference to World War II. So let's talk a little bit about Benito Mussolini. I have some photos on the slide here. So just at the very foremost, if you don't know who Mussolini is at all, he is the dictator of Italy during World War II, but also before World War II. He is the first of the dictators to come to power, which is why I'm talking about him first. So he is the leader of the fascist political party in Italy, and then he's able to assert his authority as dictator, overthrowing the existing system. He's known as Il Duce, which means the boss. And he's often characterized by his military group, or at least well known for his military group, the Black Shirts. At first they were a paramilitary group, which means that they're not necessarily officially sanctioned or officially paid by the government, but they're used to support a political party. So he did advocate for violence in the name of getting what he believed was necessary to make Italy stronger again. So in 1922, Mussolini takes power as the leader of the Fascist Revolutionary Action political party, or the Fasci di Combattimento. And after a series of riots, you're actually seeing one of them up top in that top picture, Mussolini is able to become the prime minister, and he's appointed prime minister by the king. At this point in time, Italy has sort of a parliamentary monarchy system where they have a king, King Victor Emmanuel III, and they also have a prime minister who handles mostly the day-to-day operations of the country, and we're going to see that in a couple different places. Ultimately, though, he is able to overthrow the king. So in January of 1925, he makes this really famous speech called the January Speech. You don't have to know this, but in general, this speech was where he asserted his ultimate authority. He had certain opponents who were rioting against him, mostly the communists. So Mussolini is very adamantly anti-communist, which is ironic because right after World War I, he was a communist. But then he, creates his fascist movement. And he defends the Black Shirts publicly. So it was well known that the Black Shirts were perpetrating all sorts of violent acts. And he comes out and he says, I support the Black Shirts and they are fighting for a noble cause. And any socialists who disagreed with him were oppressed. So that's very important. So when we talk about the goals of Mussolini, hopefully you're starting to see from what you know about Adolf Hitler, hopefully you're starting to see how Mussolini and Hitler shared some common goals, and that's why they were able to get along so well. So Mussolini was adamantly anti-communist, and he advocated for preventing communism from infiltrating Italy and returning Italy to the glory of the Roman Empire. That's very important. Territorial expansion and economic rise. Italy was feeling slighted and ignored by the Treaty of Versailles. They felt they didn't get the land that was deserved to them. And so the population of Italy, in dealing with the global Great Depression, they feel vulnerable, they feel unheard. And Mussolini's going to come in, strong orator, right? He's very good at speaking. He can capture a crowd with his voice. And he is able to capture the attention of his citizens through his message. So I think what you see on the screen right now, is a very apt metaphor for understanding how fascist powers work and how Mussolini in particular would be so effective. So one of the common slogans of Mussolini was that he was the man who made the Italian trains run on time. Sounds, at first glance, sounds pretty positive, right? You're creating efficiency, you're creating productivity within your government, but here's the metaphor. If an Italian train was late, the people who were responsible would be arrested, tortured, or killed. On an alternative scenario, if that wasn't done, the other thing that would happen is they would just change the time, right? So the illusion of efficiency is possible in fascist governments because people's individual rights are restricted, and oppressive actions are taken by the government to make productivity happen. No one's going to say that Mussolini and Hitler weren't productive, right? They certainly got things done. And you're certainly able to do that under a dictatorship. It's how you do it, right? And that's where we run into problems, is that you're doing it in a way that completely either is corrupt, is false, or is oppressing your people. Okay, so I think from there we'll move on to Japan. So after World War I, Japan is seen as a major world power, right? They have had significant military victories, right, in the Russo-Japanese War, in the Sino-Japanese War of the early 1900s, and now in World War I. They are able to come to the Paris Peace Conference, and they have a series of goals that they want to achieve following World War I. So one of these goals is territorial expansion to feed their rapidly growing population. So as we mentioned before, throughout the Tokugawa shogunate and the Meiji Restoration, Japanese population just exploded. I mean, suddenly they just have millions and millions of people. And as we know about Japan, they have a very small territory. So they have to find a way to feed the people who now live in this territory. And so they're going to use invasion to do so. They want to recover their economy, and they want to become the dominant power in Asia and to push out the imperialist powers of the West. And then fill that vacuum with their own power. And so how are they going to do this? What type of system do they have in place? So the Meiji government system has been replaced by a military dictatorship. And so you see two pictures on your slide. The bottom picture is their emperor. Now, hopefully you remember the nature of the emperor in Japan. The emperor is descended from the sun goddess Amaterasu, and there continues to be that reverence for the emperor as being divine, right? So that's very important to remember. The emperor is not irrelevant in Japanese policy. The emperor makes choices and decisions. This is different from the shogunate system, right, that we talked about, the feudal system. The emperor actually does have some power. However, the person who's running the country on a day-to-day basis, who's making the military decisions, who's talking to other leaders, that would be the prime minister. So the prime minister is the leader of the military dictatorship. And in 1941, Hideki Tojo becomes the leader of this military dictatorship in Japan. He had a significant role as a general within the army and then a leader within the government before he was appointed to be the prime minister. So obviously there's other leaders in the years going up to World War II, but Hideki Tojo and Emperor Hirohito are the important ones to talk about. So when we start to talk about aggressive actions, in 1931, Japan begins invading Manchuria, which you know is in northeastern China, in an effort to gain more land for themselves. They have already invaded Korea, and the China gets alarmed, right? China is protesting to the League of Nations, saying they're not allowed to do this. This is a violation of the League of Nations, and the League of Nations is, pretty helpless, right? Pretty incapable of controlling that, and so Japan just. They keep going because they're not being punished for it, but then they just leave, right? They're like, well, if you're going to keep hassling us about taking land that we believe is ours to take, then we're just going to leave the League of Nations, which once again just reinforces how ineffective the League of Nations was at its job. Okay, moving on, let's talk a little bit about Stalin. Sometimes Stalin gets forgotten about in this mix of dictators because he was allied with France and Britain and the United States, which were the three major democracies of the era. So you do have some background in communism, but Stalinism isn't a pure form of communism. It's a corrupt form of communism, and it's one of the best examples of how humans have completely failed at enacting Marx's perfect vision for what communism should be, right? We've always said that pure communism is, or at least has been so far on Earth, unattainable. And Joseph Stalin is really the poster child for failed communism. He's certainly not any type of leader that anyone should advocate to be like. He takes over in 1924. And when we want to just quickly redefine communism, or at least give you a new definition, so it's an economic and a government system that advocates for shared property and a lack of private ownership, right? Because if you remember Karl Marx, he's trying to say that the bourgeoisie, right, or the upper middle class, the factory owners, are persecuting or exploiting the proletariat, right, the working class. And so in ideal communism, there is no government, there is no state, and there is no upper classes. There is no class system at all. But in Stalin's communism, the government does have substantial amounts of power. In fact, the government is the power. The government is the one that's reassigning land and redistributing things and pulling property away from the middle classes. And the problem is not in the policy of shared ownership and a lack of private ownership, it is how it's accomplished. So here's what Stalin does. If you don't remember, Russia is a huge country, right? There's millions and millions of people. And so here's what Stalin does that kind of characterizes him as a dictator. So he wants to establish the collectivization of farms and the removal of any private farms. And that will lead, in his belief, that will lead to more efficiency and a removal of the class system. He wants to change Russia into an industrial country that has railroads and electric grid and telephone lines and things like that. But he does not believe that there should be any private ownership of such industry, that the government should be in charge of all of that. And so in doing this, he has to take property away from people. And these people, especially the people who are in the middle class, not the peasants so much, because at first the peasants are in favor of this. They're part of the revolution that happened in 1917 in Russia. They were promised peace, bread, and land, right? But the middle class, they feel like they have property that they don't want to be taken away from them. So Stalin had this 5-year plan that Russia was going to be able to catch and overtake the capitalist countries. And here are some of the ways that he was aggressive. And I should maybe even clarify that and add the word oppressive, right? Because it's one thing to be aggressive, but it's another thing to oppress your people. So he killed, sometimes it's upwards of 13 million, but usually the number sits between 10 million and 20 million Russians through starvation and blatant murder. So basically, if a middle-class citizen or any citizen refused to agree to the terms of the collectivization, they would be sent to the gulags, which were government-run forced labor camps, where often people would die of starvation or overwork or disease. And then oftentimes, even within the government, he would purge, his coworkers, right, his government officials who he believed were plotting against him. He was intensely paranoid about being overthrown, and he would kill his opponents, and he would kill any political enemies. There's a complete lack of freedom within Stalin's communist Soviet Union, and on par with the actions of Hitler and Mussolini is Joseph Stalin. It just so happens that his location and his views against Hitler lead him to be a useful ally to the British, the French, and the Americans in World War II. So it's important to understand how that works. When we talk about communism in the next unit, we will get a little bit more into Stalinism versus Leninism versus what happens in China with Mao Zedong. So we will return to talking about a little bit more about Stalin. Here's a picture from inside a gulag, a Russian work camp. And then you may want to screenshot this slide. This is a good comparison of fascism and communism. The thing about fascism and communism is ideologically, they're supposed to be these opposites, right? You have fascism is sometimes considered to be the far right, and then communism considered to be the far left. Just one little interlude about the words left and right. We hear those so often in American government systems, and even just any type of political science conversation that you have. This actually comes from French Revolution France. Actually, even before that, from the Estates General system. Do you remember that? It had to do with where they sat within the Estates General. So the first and the second estates sat on the right side, and the third estate sat on the left side. And the idea was that the first and the second estate represented political hierarchy. They represent division, and they represent a class system, right? And then the third estate represented the left, right? Or the lack of class system, equality, right? Egalitarianism. And so that's where those come from. Even in the U.S. government, they've kind of gone on to have much deeper meaning. But yeah, that's where it comes from, the seats in the Estates General. But anyway, when we talk about fascism, initially fascism didn't consider itself to be right-wing. But because they were so anti-communism, they now have been so closely associated with the right wing. So on both sides, we're seeing authoritarianism. But in communism, that's not the intent, right? The intent is collectivism, which is unique because you always hear this word collectivist, right? Communism is collective. But what about fascism? Doesn't that word come from bundle, right? Collective, we are stronger together. So at the core of these two supposedly opposite ideas, we see similar themes coming out, right? Similar characteristics. So I would say that in this sheet right here, we're actually seeing a comparison of fascism to ideal communism. Because in Stalin's communism, we certainly don't believe that, we certainly don't believe, or at least Stalin doesn't believe, that there is no necessity for violence, right? Violence is essential to getting this accomplished, according to Stalin. So it's just interesting to me, if you're to draw a spectrum, a political spectrum. If I were to go up to the board, or actually just right on here, and draw a line, right, across where we have the left and the right, and the left is communism, and the right is fascism, I feel like this is not the best visual representation of the difference between these. I think what would actually be better is if you had like a pipe cleaner or something that would bend like a piece of wire, and you could have it, kind of go around in a circle where the extremes of communism and fascism are actually almost meeting. You're almost seeing similarities between the two extremes. And so they're supposedly opposite ends of the spectrum, but in reality, they're so similar. Okay, finally, last but not least, we're talking about Hitler, who is the personification of evil in World War II, in my opinion. And the Nazis go along with his vision. So let's talk about his goals and his aims as dictator of Germany. So, something we've been trying to emphasize over the past couple lessons is the Treaty of Versailles and how that contributed to German bitterness. And so, I say in this bullet point right here that it was his growing bitterness, but I should point out that he is not alone, right? He is bitter, but so are the German people, right? So he is using a common emotion and a common feeling to profess his goals. And then, of course, what is probably the most famous thing about Hitler is his belief of racial superiority of the German people, and how that leads to him to exploit and discriminate and persecute the Jewish people, among other minority groups that he thought were unworthy of being German citizens. So particularly his bitterness at Versailles was isolated to the war guilt clause, the payment of reparation, territory losses, demilitarization, the aspects that were most detrimental to Germany. Okay, so quickly, when we talk about his rise to power, we're talking about his leadership of the National Socialist German Workers' Party, which is the Nazis. That nickname comes from the fact that in German, when you say the word nationalist, it's like Nazia, and so it sounds like Nazi. And so he fought in World War I. After World War I, I was actually injured during World War I. And afterwards, then he gets into politics, right? And the Nazis, even though they have the name socialist in their title, they are not socialist. They are very adamantly anti-communist. They're anti-communist, anti-Jewish, and they hold a lot of animosity towards the German government at the time, the Weimar Republic. So in 1921, Hitler is appointed the leader of the Nazi Party. In 1923, though, he has this powerful aspiration. He's looking at Mussolini in Italy, and he is inspired by Mussolini and Mussolini's actions. And so he tries to take over, right? He tries a coup d'etat, that's the word, right? And it means a government takeover. He is arrested, right? He goes to jail, and in jail, he famously writes his famous book, right? Mein Kampf, My Struggle. And in Mein Kampf outline many of his racist ideologies and his belief of German superiority. In 1933, he is able to rise again to the tippy top of power within the German Weimar Republic. He is appointed chancellor after an election. So there was an election, the Nazis won the majority in the Reichstag is what it's called, but it really is like the German Congress or the German Parliament. And he is appointed chancellor. This is very similar to the British system, where whatever political party wins the majority, they get to elect the leader or the prime minister, right? So Boris Johnson is a conservative, and his party has the most votes within the British Parliament. And the same thing happens under the Reichstag. But in addition to the chancellor, the German system also has a president, and that president is Hindenburg. And so Hindenburg is kind of taking a back seat to Hitler as chancellor. And so for several years, Hitler is able to work effectively as chancellor. In 1934, Hindenburg dies, and Hitler does not follow the constitutional procedure. He just declares himself Führer, or dictator, and he has complete unchecked power, and he's able to officially establish his goal of creating a Third Reich. Just some etymology of that word, Third Reich, and where that comes from. The idea from Hitler was that the First Reich was the Roman Empire, and the Second Reich was the Holy Roman Empire, which used to be Germany. If you remember us talking about the Holy Roman Empire during the Renaissance and during the Reformation with Martin Luther, and he's trying to establish its successor, which he believed was the Third Reich. Okay, I know this is a long slide, but Hitler is very important to understanding World War II. So let's talk about Hitler's ideology, right? We know that he believes that the Germans are the master race, and that the Germans are the Aryan people, right? And that he wants to purify the German race. And so the deep irony here is that Aryan is descended from the Persians and the people from the Indian subcontinent, and not, just within the sake of demographics, not the Germans. So he has a hatred towards the Jewish people. He blames the Jewish people for the economic problems of Germany. And his goal is to, obviously, like I just said, unite the master race of Germans. But he has this word that he uses all the time, Lebensraum, which means living space. And so his idea is that he will conquer Poland and all of Europe, really, especially Eastern Europe, to give the German people space to live and to grow food and to feed themselves. And so that's the idea. And then in order to do so, you have to kill the people who live there currently, right? And of course, eliminate the Jewish people, but also the minorities as well. So the really common theme or question that comes up all the time is, why did Hitler hate the Jewish people? And there's no clear answer. He writes certainly many, many hateful things about the Jewish people, but there's not really a clear event or moment that would have inspired him to do that or to believe that. A lot of times the line would be that he was inspired by his own partial Jewish heritage, and he felt a resentment of that, and so that's sometimes is considered to be a motivation of his hatred. But in general, there's not necessarily a cause. The one thing I will say is that Hitler is not the first person to be anti-Semitic. There was a growing bout of anti-Semitism in Europe around this time. Initially, right during the Middle Ages, the idea was that the persecution of the Jews was a religious thing, right? It was that most of Europe was Christian, and the Jews and the Christians had historically had so many religious differences. But then in the 19th century or the 1800s, that really started to morph into racism and a racist ideology that was perpetrated. And Hitler was inspired by a lot of German leaders during his youth who would exploit and discriminate against the Jewish people. Of course, not to the extent that he ultimately ended up doing it. Okay. When we talk about Hitler, you can't ignore his charisma as a leader, right? This is not to say that he was a good leader or that he had any actions that were worthy of praise, but he certainly had a way of captivating people who felt vulnerable in Germany, right? Okay, so when we talk about dictators, one of the major things we talk about is how they were aggressive, right? And when I say aggression, I mean invading of property. Now, this was specifically banned for the Germans under the Treaty of Versailles, right? They were not to have a military, and they were not to take over land that was strictly taken away from them. So Hitler completely ignores the Treaty of Versailles. And like we talked about, Japan completely ignores the League of Nations by invading China in 1933. In 1935, the Germans rearm, which is a terrifying reality for the French, right? This is the one thing that they were afraid of. And then the Germans reoccupy the Rhineland. And I'll show you a picture of that in a second, just so you get a sense of what that means. The Italians invade Ethiopia. We use this word Anschluss to talk about the annexation of Austria. So the Germans invade Austria. And this is all land that they believe is theirs to take. And I should have this on here, but in 1938, the Germans also annexed what's called the Sudetenland, and I'll tell you what the Sudetenland is, but it's basically an area of Czechoslovakia that they believed should be theirs because it was occupied by mostly German citizens. In 1939, this is the moment where the war is considered to start with Germany's invasion of Poland. And so, while this is happening, while this aggression is building in Germany, what are France and England thinking? We know that they're afraid, but they actually do take actions to try to prevent this. So they're getting nervous. And in 1938, Hitler is making moves like he will invade Czechoslovakia. And so Neville Chamberlain, who is famously the Prime Minister of Great Britain in the beginning of the war, advocates for a policy called appeasement, where he actually goes to Munich in 1938 and he meets with Hitler. You can see the picture on the slide. This on the left is Neville Chamberlain and on the right is Adolf Hitler. And they meet and they sign a policy called appeasement. Now, I'll have to post some of the political cartoons that often come up with appeasement because it is heavily criticized as being a horrible idea. But at the time, Neville Chamberlain really thought that he had solved the problem. He thought that he had won. He promised Hitler that he could take the Sudetenland. He could recapture that as long as he agreed not to invade anything else. He was not permitted to take Czechoslovakia, Austria, or Poland. To me, this reminds me of, however many of you have dogs. If you try to give your dog a piece of food off the table, does that make your dog go away? Absolutely not. Your dog will be back 5 minutes later or less, 30 seconds later, right, for more food. And that's what happened to Hitler, right? He was told, okay, here's your land, go away. You got a little piece of Sudetenland. And he just comes right back for more. So he is not able to be appeased. So let me show you the picture of the slide. Oh wait, this is Neville Chamberlain coming back on the plane from Munich, and I'll show you. I'll insert a clip of the speech right here. But he heavily praised appeasement, and he said that this was the solution for peace in our time. This is greatly ironic, right? Because just 1 year later, we'll be involved in one of the greatest wars in the history of mankind.
The settlement of the Czechoslovakian problem, which has now been achieved, is, in my view, only the prelude to a larger settlement in which all Europe may find peace. This morning, I had another talk with the German Chancellor, Herr Hitler. And here is the paper which bears his name upon it as well as mine. Some of you perhaps have already heard what it contains, but I would just like to read it to you. We, the German Führer and Chancellor, and the British Prime Minister have had a further meeting today and are agreed in recognizing that the question of Anglo-German relations is of the first importance for the two countries and for Europe. We regard the agreement signed last night and the Anglo-German naval agreement as symbolic of the desire of our two peoples never to go to war with one another again.
And then let me just show you this map right here. So really important things on here. This is the Rhineland over here. So this is called the Rhineland because the Rhine River goes right through it. This is a terrifying land for France, or terrifying thing for France, that Germany reoccupies that in 1936 because obviously, as you can see, it is very, very close to France. And so France is just terrified that the next step for Germany will be invading France. The striped land right here, this is the Sudetenland. It's kind of like U-shaped. That is the area that Germany believed belonged to them because a lot of German people lived there. But under the Treaty of Versailles, this actually, including the Sudetenland, is Czechoslovakia. No, I just totally spelled that wrong. Oh well, that's Czechoslovakia. And then eventually in 1938, he also invades Austria. And so you can see that he's just getting greedy and greedy and greedy. And now he really wants Danzig in Poland, but in order to do so, he's going to have to invade Poland, which he does in 1939. And that is what starts the official start date of World War II. However, there's many other days and moments that you can argue would be the start of World War II, right? The ascension of Hitler to the dictatorship, the invasion of Manchuria by the Japanese, right? There's all these different moments that we could say are essential to understanding the German increasing aggression and the start of World War II. Okay, I know that I talked on forever, so I will stop right here.